There was one road worth the name, and it went north. It carried the men going up. It carried the wagons behind the men, and the guns behind the wagons, and the shells behind the guns, and the field kitchen somewhere behind the shells. It carried the ambulances coming back the other way, against all of that, on the same width of mud. It had been shelled for 4 years, and mended by nobody, because the frontier had not moved since September of 1914, and there was no reason on earth to repair a road that ran into no man's land. On the 26th of September, 1918, an American army started up that road, and up the few others like it, into a corridor of ground about 16 miles wide. The Argonne forest closed it on the west, thick and cut with ravines. The river Meuse and a wall of high ground closed it on the east. In the middle stood a hill with a village on top, and from that hill a man could watch almost everything the Americans were about to do. The plan was a breakthrough. What happened was a road being cleared, a few hundred yards at a time, for 47 days, by 1,200,000 men, most of whom had been civilians a year before. This is the story of those 47 days. Before we settle in for the night, if long, quiet history like this helps you rest, a like or a subscription helps. The Long Watch reach other people who fall asleep to the past. An episode like this one takes weeks of reading and assembling, and that one small tap genuinely keeps the watch going. Now get comfortable. There is no hurry in any of this, and nothing in the next 2 hours needs to be remembered. Everything that follows was settled by ground and by weather, and by how much could be got up one road in a day. That is where the army had to start, so that is where this starts. Between the river and the forest, the line had stood in the same place since September of 1914. It shifted a little when the German attacks came against Verdun in 1916, and again during the French counterattack of August 1917. Both times it settled back into the ground it had left. Apart from those two movements, it did not change until 1918. Standing still did not mean lying quiet. The country on either side of the old line had been broken up by shell fire through all 4 of those years. The few roads that crossed it were almost entirely destroyed in what had been no man's land. Shell holes and mine craters were the ordinary surface of it. And that is how the photographs of this front were labeled. The corridor had 2 walls, and both of them looked inward. On the right, immediately east of the Meuse, the height stood up as a natural barrier and gave the defense excellent platforms. From them, the country on either side of the river could be watched and covered with artillery fire. Guns placed there could fire obliquely across the western bank into the flank of anything moving north. On the left, the Argonne forest did the same work from the other side. Batteries in the forest, carefully fortified, covered that flank, and their fire could cross with the fire of the guns on the eastern bank. Whatever came up the corridor came up between them. Both walls had 4 years of machine guns, trenches and obstacles added to what the ground already gave. From a point near Forge, the whole front of the attack could be traced. It began at the Meuse on the right, ran along the forward slopes of a low ridge, past Bétoncourt, went by to the left of Maloncourt, and ended about 16 miles away, near the far edge of the forest. That figure is from the survey of the American Battle Monuments Commission. Below the ridge, the Forge brook lay in a marshy valley. Halfway between the river and the forest, a hill called Montfaucon stood over everything around it. It gave the defense perfect observation, and what nature had given it had been increased by field works of every sort. From the top, a man could follow the ground the attack would have to cross, most of the way to the start line. Between the two great bulwarks, this was the third place that looked down. North of the hill, the country goes on rising and falling in wooded, broken heights that favor a defensive battle. Numerous ridges run east and west across the district, and they suited defensive lines tying the heights beyond the river to the forest. Where those ridges come down into the valleys of the Meuse and of the small river Ayres, they gave the machine guns their positions. The Meuse comes past Verdun and works northwest in long bends until, near Sedan, it turns and runs due west. East of the forest, the Ayres runs in a narrow valley of its own. Between that valley and the valley of the Meuse, a whaleback of high ground rises behind the German front. The road up the Ayres Valley crosses the river at Varennes. The defense here was not a line but a zone. The second and third positions lay so close behind the first that they made a nearly continuous belt of trenches, wire and field works, about 10 miles deep by the same survey. To reach the Hindenburg line on this front, the American commander's report said, a penetration of 12 to 15 kilometers was required. The reason for choosing this ground lay behind it. Near Sedan and southeast of it, the German railways came together and ran through a narrow strip of country, lying within 35 miles of the front line. The corridor pointed at the shortest distance to something that could not be picked up and moved. On the western side of the corridor, a bare hill still carried the name of a village. Vauquois stood there in 1914, and the height mattered for what could be seen from it. Both armies mined underneath, driving deep tunnels beneath the opposing lines and firing enormous quantities of explosive in them, until the town on top was blasted away. One front line ran along a lip of a crater, and the other along the opposite edge. Roads were the scarce thing here, and the scarcity is recorded division by division. In one division sector there was no road at all. Once its transport had crossed the trench system, it had to zigzag back through a neighboring sector to reach its own ground. On the left, one main road carried the supply of a corps with 3 divisions in line. Aisnes, where several tracks met, was photographed as a road center. What roads there were had to be practically built again while the traffic was already moving over them, so that troops and supplies could go forward and the wounded come back. Moving men and stores over them, the American commander's report said, was one of the most delicate and difficult tasks of the war. Off the roadway there was old wire on both sides. The forest was the hardest ground in the corridor. Under the trees it is cut by ravines with abrupt sides. The underbrush is heavy, and rock comes out of the slopes in many places. In the zone of the advance, the belt of woods ran about 4 miles from its western edge to its eastern one. Nothing about it resembled the parkland idea of a European forest. It was not the only forest here either. The country around Montfaucon carried a mass of woods as thick as the Argonne, broken by a single open space hardly wider than a road. Its sections were named after the nearest villages: Bétancourt, Chepy, Maloncourt, Cuisy. Men who fought in those woods were fighting in a forest that had no name of its own on the map. Autumn in this part of France brings a thick clinging mist that only bright sun or a strong wind will drive off. The cold rains were due in October, and once they had started, there was no good weather left to wait for. Men who had grown up where ice covered the lakes and the streams in winter suffered less at home than they did in these mists and rains at 40 and 50 degrees. Color went out of the landscape. Khaki, uniform and equipment, and the shade of the trucks the caissons, and the ambulances all matched the mud they stood in. The mud was the tone of the country. The sky above was leaden and webbed. The only bright things in it were the hot flashes from the gun muzzles and the red and blue bullseye painted on an aeroplane. The divisions coming into this ground in September lived on it for weeks before they used it. Days of waiting, cleaning up, refitting in rain, a shelter tent pitched and ditched, and then orders to move on. No lights of any kind were allowed so near the line. A staff crossing country at night used a pocket torch only now and then to keep the horses out of the deep holes. The French commander-in-chief, looking at the same ground, gave it as his opinion that the American advance would not get farther than Montfaucon before winter. That was the hill in the middle, with the forest along one side of the corridor, and the heights beyond the river along the other. The whole floor of it lay in view from the top. In April of 1917, the United States Army was 200,000 men. 2/3 of them were regulars. The other third was National Guard, called into federal service for duty on the Mexican border. Camps for the men who would follow were authorized in May. The last site for a cantonment was taken up on the 6th of July. By the 4th of September, there was room in those camps for 430,000 men. The capacity was carried soon afterwards to 770,000. Through August and September, the divisions of the National Guard and of the National Army were organized in wooden streets laid out on ground that had been farmland in the spring. The law of the 19th of May put the manpower of the nation, from 18 to 45 years of age, within reach of the draft. The first registration on the 5th of June took the ages from 21 to 31. More than 24 million men were registered under it, and 2,800,000 were called. 12 out of every 100 registered. Of every 100 men in the Army, 77 belonged to the National Army raised by draft. The unit a man was trained in was the division, and the division was the typical fighting body. In the American Army, it held about 1,000 officers and 27,000 men. Sorting organizations of about 10,000 were called depot brigades. As far as possible, though, a new soldier went at once into the division he would fight with. The camps sorted the country by geography, and the result reads like a list of places. New York City filled one camp on Long Island. Another in Maryland took northeastern Pennsylvania, Maryland and the District of Columbia. One in Georgia took Georgia, Alabama, and Tennessee. One on the plains took Missouri and Kansas. One division needed no training ground at all. The time this took can be given as an average, worked out from the records of nearly 1,400,000 men who did their fighting in France. The soldier who went over had 6 months of training at home before he sailed. After landing, he had 2 months more. Then came a month in a quiet sector, and after that an active one and heavy fighting. One history written just after the war put the distance in a single sentence. From men who a year earlier had tumbled into training camps at home, knowing neither the manual of arms nor the first elements of army etiquette and discipline, to the marching of trained divisions forward into the battle line in France. Counted in months for the average man, it was closer to 9 than to 12. An army of 4 million required about 200,000 officers. Some 180,000 of them had to be found outside the regular army. 3 months of intensive work in the training camps carried a candidate through every task required of a private, and then through the duties of a platoon and company commander. That kind of camp gave the Army nearly half of all its officers. France and England, soon after the first camps opened, sent over some of their ablest officers from the Western Front to bring the methods approved there into American training. The largest single group of them taught artillery, about 15 in every 100. After that came signaling, minor tactics, and fortification, each with its own instructors. The army was divided by race. Black soldiers, listed in the records of the time as colored troops, served in units kept separate from the rest. 2 divisions of the National Army were formed that way, the 92nd and the 93rd. Their parts trained in separate units at camps from Kansas to New Jersey. The 92nd was organized in November of 1917 from draftees drawn from every part of the country, and was at full strength by May. When the attack in the corridor opened, that division stood in reserve of the corps on the left, less one of its infantry regiments, and without its own artillery brigade, for which another had been substituted. The missing regiment was in the corridor, in a French-American liaison group holding the joint between the 2 armies. The regiments of the 93rd were not there at all. They served west of the forest in Champagne as parts of French divisions, one under French command from April 1918. What all these men had to be handed was the second problem. There were nearly 600,000 Springfield rifles in the country when war was declared, enough to arm about 1 million men. Production could not be pushed much above 1,000 a day, so a new rifle was designed, chambered for the Springfield cartridge but built on plants tooled for a British contract. More than 2.5 million of the 2 rifles together were made before the armistice. The guns were the harder half. When war was declared, there were 900 pieces of field artillery in the country, 544 of them 3-inch field guns. 50 guns were required to equip 1 division. That stock was enough for 11 of them, at a moment when the plans being drawn ran into dozens of divisions. In June of 1917, the decision was taken to keep the American guns at home for training. The troops in France would be armed with artillery of French and British standard calibers, bought there and paid for in steel, copper, and raw material. It settled the matter of ammunition as well, since a standard caliber could be fed from stocks already in the country where it stood. The arrangement can be measured. Out of every 100 days that the fighting divisions were in the line, they were supported by their own artillery for 75 days, by British artillery for 5, and by French artillery for 1.5 days. For the remaining 18.5 days they had none. Of those, 18 fell in quiet sectors, and half a day in an active one. 227 light tanks received from the French carried the weight of active service overseas. 64 heavy tanks came from the British. American engineers built 17 new berths in French ports and 1,000 miles of track behind them. The Signal Corps strung 100,000 miles of wire, and 40,000 trucks went across before the armistice. The quartermaster's record shows what a man wore through it. Over the 6 months from June to November, the average private in France drew a raincoat and an overcoat every 5 months, a blanket, a flannel shirt, and breeches every 2 months, a coat every 79 days, shoes and puttees every 51 days, woolen socks every 23 days. Food was held at a 45-day reserve and never fell below it. Getting them there was the last of it. More than 2 million American soldiers were carried to France in the 19 months of the war. In July of 1918, more than 306,000 crossed, an average of over 10,000 a day for every day of the month. The shipping held that pitch through the summer. 42 divisions were trained and shipped overseas before the armistice, and 16 more were in training or forming. The plans called for 80 divisions in France by July of 1919 and 100 by the end of that year. On the 4th of October 1918, in a French village, the Allied commander was settling the shipments of the coming winter, 38 days before the end of the war. In the middle of April 1918, the 1st Division came out of its billets and moved by road toward the front west of Montdidier. The march took 4 days. To spare what strength the horses had left, the men of the field artillery walked the whole way, and the teams pulled only the guns and wagons. Each night the columns went into quarters, and each morning formed again. The sector they took over ran from a little north of Contigny to a little south of Mesnil-Saint-Georges. About 4 kilometers of front, at the point of the salient driven into the Allied line in March, shell fire was heavy enough that the position could not be improved. No trenches were dug and no wire put out. Nothing moved in the forward zone by daylight, because the smallest sign of a man drew fire onto the place where he stood. Elsewhere the line was moving. Between the 21st of March and the middle of July, the German army put in at least 5 large offensives. The first was stopped a few miles short of Amiens. The second, in April, came down on the Lys, and about 500 Americans were in it. On the 28th of March, the American commander had placed all his forces at the disposal of Marshal Foch. The attack on the village was rehearsed before it was made. Ground was found well behind the lines, near Maison-Celle-Tuileries and Saint-Usoy, repeating the slopes of Contigny as closely as was practical. On that ground, the German trench system was built out of the earth as the aeroplane photograph showed it, corrected by the sketches patrols and observers had brought back. Every unit down to the platoon went over the copy and worked its own part of the attack, and small teams practiced their particular tasks alone. Maps carrying everything the division had gathered were issued down as far as platoon commanders. French tanks came to the field so the infantry could learn to walk beside them, and aeroplanes flew over and dropped weighted messages for the men who would collect them on the day. On the 28th of May, the preparation opened at 5:45, every gun onto its assigned target at a set rate of fire. Not fewer than 2 heavy pieces worked over each of the enemy battery positions. Howitzers and trench mortars took the trenches, the machine gun posts, and the roads behind. French aeroplanes held the air. 5 German batteries answered and were put down by counter-battery fire. At 6:45, the field guns lifted into a rolling barrage that moved 100 meters every 2 minutes, and the infantry rose and followed it in 3 lines. The objective ran 500 meters beyond the village and bent back to the old positions on a front of more than 2 kilometers. All of it was in hand at 20 minutes past 7, at the named hour. The place was held. Before any American came near it, the village had already been taken and lost twice. By the casualty records of the division, the operation cost 45 officers and 1,022 men, and 200 of that number were entered as gassed. Those are the division's own figures, kept in its own books. A day earlier, a long way to the southeast, something else had begun. On the 27th of May, the Germans came on between Bay-Riobac and the Oise. It took the French line completely by surprise. They broke through, crossed the Aisne, the Vesle and the Ourcq, one after another, and within days their leading troops stood on the Marne. On the 31st, the 2nd Division, resting northwest of Paris and expecting to relieve the 1st, was turned round and hurried to Meaux. Early on the 1st of June, it deployed across the road from Château-Thierry to Paris at Montreuil-aux-Lyon in a gap in the French line, and the advance along it was stopped. Elements of the 3rd Division entered the line at Château-Thierry the same day. For 5 days the fighting was defensive. By the 5th of June, the front of the 2nd Division was firmly established at the point of the Marne salient nearest Paris. It did not yet take in Hill 142, or the Bois de Belle-Eau, or the villages of Bourèche and Vaux, all of which lay in front of it and in German hands. On the 6th, the division went over to the attack on its own front, and what it began there did not end until the 1st of July. The Hill and Bourèche were taken that day. The wood took the rest of the month and was reported entirely cleared on the 26th of June. Vaux was taken on the 1st of July. Toward the end of June, an order went out over the signature of General Duguit, commanding the French army on that front, that in all official documents the wood would carry the name Bois de la Brigade de Marine. Earlier in the month, a regiment of the 3rd Division had spent several days in the village of Belleau itself, while the fighting for the trees went on. The count of days is set down in the history of the Marine Corps. 31 days of continuous fighting, of which the last 26 were classed at General Headquarters as a local engagement. The cost of those days, as that history gives it, was 9,063 in all, Marines and soldiers together. Downstream, the 3rd Division held the river itself, and by the 14th of July, its front along the Marne was 10 kilometers long. The next morning, the Germans attacked again, and the western flank of the attack crossed the water. 2 German divisions tried to break the divisional front and were stopped in the outpost zone. In the night, the enemy went back to the northern bank, and by the 17th, the line west of Meuse was restored. The counterstroke was aimed at the western face of the pocket the Germans had eaten into the French line between Soissons and Reims. Marshal Foch chose the ground for it. The point of the attack was a French corps of 3 divisions, the American 1st on the left, the Moroccan division in the center, and the American 2nd on the right. Getting them onto that ground took a day and a night. From the halting place in the Compiègne forest to the jumping-off line was more than 10 kilometers. All day the single road out through Mortefontaine carried French artillery and American wagons of every kind, and military police stood every few yards in the village street to keep it open. The infantry, the engineers, and the machine gunners lay off the road in the woods through the afternoon, taking what rest the wet weather and muddy ground allowed. After dark, the columns went on. Not long after they were strung out, a storm of tropical violence broke over the march, with sheets of lightning and rain onto the road. The guns came up in their own way. French lorries had dragged them part of the distance and left them short of the sector. During the night, the tired teams were brought forward, hooked in, and pulled them into the pits the gunners had prepared. Water carts were filled at every kitchen, and the rolling kitchens made ready with food cooked to follow the troops. No registration fire was permitted and no preliminary bombardment, so that the surprise would be complete. 0 hour was 35 minutes past 4. In the last minutes before it, a red rocket went up from the enemy's line, and a heavy defensive barrage came down along the front. It lasted a few minutes. Then the hour came. The guns fired together, and the barrage lay down in front of the infantry. An order issued in August by the French commander on that front set out what had been done before the great offensive of the 18th of July. The wood that now carried the Marine Brigade's name, the village of Vaux, and the stand made on the Marne at Fossois. It was written as a list of places in the manner of such orders. At Bonbon on the 24th of July, it was settled that the first operation of the American Army would be the reduction of the Saint-Mihiel salient. A condition came with that decision. The ground there was marshy, and the work had to be begun and finished before the autumn rains, which in that country usually came about the middle of September. On the 10th of August, an American army was formed under the personal command of General Pershing, and the same day it was ordered to concentrate secretly in the Saint-Mihiel sector. 3 weeks later, it took over the battlefront from Port-sur-Seine to Watronville, southeast of Verdun. The salient in front of it had been made in September 1914, and its shape had hardly changed in 4 years. On the map it was a triangle with corners at Pont-à-Mousson, at Saint-Mihiel, and at Verdun, 25 miles along the base, and 16 miles driven into the Allied lines. The plain of the Wavru inside it was low ground cut by streams and dotted with groves, with many ponds and marshy patches, and away from the roads movement was hard in wet weather. 2 hills stood out of the German lines on the southern face, Loupemont and Montsec, and from either of them an observer could look a long way back into the Allied rear. Early in September, the operation was given strictly limited objectives, so that within about 10 days, the same army could begin a second and much larger offensive between the Meuse and the Argonne forest. That was the undertaking. 2 great offensives on battlefields 40 miles apart, inside 23 days. What made the first of them different was set down afterwards in plain words. It was the first operation of the war carried out by a complete American army, under the separate and independent command of the American Commander-in-Chief. The weight gathered for it can be counted, about 3,000 guns, and something like 3,300,000 rounds brought into the area beforehand, about 400 French tanks, some of them with American crews, 1,481 aeroplanes, the largest concentration of air power yet made, most of the machines French and British. It rained. By the 10th of September, it had been raining off and on for 5 days, and on the 12th, when the attack went in, it poured. Flying could be done only at 250 meters that day, and the machines went up one at a time. To keep the preparation from being photographed, a pilot had been held over the aerodrome at 5,000 meters, and the aircraft below were camouflaged and never left in view. The bombardment opened at 1 in the morning of the 12th, and the infantry of the main attack went forward at 5. On the western face, the preparation ran on until 8, and the troops there followed it in. That evening orders went out to push on to Vigneulles, and part of the 26th Division came to the place by a narrow forest road that led into the heart of the salient. Vigneulles was taken soon after 2 in the morning. At daybreak, the 26th met patrols of the 1st Division northeast of the village, and the salient was closed. By that evening, practically every objective had been reached. Local attacks went on until the 16th, and on the 17th, the army counted its new front 21 miles shorter than the old one. The record of the operation, as the American Battle Monuments Commission gives it, is fewer than 9,000 casualties, more than 15,000 prisoners, about 450 guns taken, and better than 200 square miles of France in hand again. On the second day, the reserve divisions and part of the army artillery were already moving northwest. 14 days stood between the two offensives, and almost all the artillery, the air units, and the auxiliary troops meant for the second were tied to the first until its success was assured. About 220,000 Allied soldiers were moved out of the Argonne area, and approximately 600,000 Americans were moved into it. 15 divisions came into the concentration, 7 out of the salient, the others from quiet sectors, from a training area, from billets behind the line. 2 went in openly. On the 10th of September, 1 division took over a wide piece of the new front, and on the 16th, another took the sector beside it, both in daylight. Everything else moved in the dark. French soldiers stayed in the outpost along most of that front until the last possible minute, so that nothing new would be seen from across the way. By day, all activity stopped, and the men who had marched until dawn kept under cover out of sight. No new road could be built. Nothing shows to an airman faster than the line of a fresh road, so ammunition could be stacked in the woods, but nothing could be run out to it. Photographs were laid side by side day after day, and the smallest difference between yesterday's picture and today's was proof that something was moving. An unusual number of lorries showed at once. Airmen were working low over their own ground now, 1,000 feet where they had once kept 12. Camouflage was the standing concern of everyone with any responsibility at all. And its object was simple. The country by daylight had to look exactly as it had looked through the quiet months. Military police stood at the turnings and stopped any driver who thought one flash of a headlamp would do no harm. There were few railways in that part of France, and they could not take the load, so troops and guns that would ordinarily have gone by train went on their own wheels and feet. Speeds did not match inside a column. Artillery tractors made 3 miles an hour, with vehicles capable of 10 and 15 behind them. Blocks came often when a gun or lorry slid into a rut in the dark. Horses were worked past their strength and could not be rested, and some nights they covered only half the distance the tables called for. Men who had marched all night looked for sleep in the villages, in houses, in barns, on haylofts. Columns stood a long time at crossroads waiting their turn to move. All of that was directed from Bar-le-Duc by a French officer who was an old master of the work, with a telephone at his elbow, in touch with the American and French units, and moving the figures about on his map. The sacred road ran full again, though now the traffic turned off to the left before it reached Verdun. On the 22nd of September, the sector from Fresnes-en-Wavre to the western edge of the Argonne passed to General Pershing, and Army headquarters moved to Souilly, southwest of Verdun. Everything was to be in place by the morning of the 25th. Infantry, guns, aviation, tanks, 13 days after the first attack. On the night of the 25th, the Army stood on its new front. 9 divisions were in the line for the opening. 5 of them had been in an offensive before. 4 of the 9 were to be supported by artillery brigades they had never worked with. None of that could be seen from the air or from the posts across the way. And in the daylight of the 25th of September, the country looked as it had looked all summer. By day, the roads behind the front carried nothing. Anything moving on them could be seen from the high ground in the middle of the corridor, and so nothing moved. Then the light went out of the sky on the 25th of September, and the roads filled at once, laboring horses, guns and caissons, trucks, long columns of infantry walking north. 2 of the rifle regiments moved off at 7 that evening, one out of a small wood, the other from a forest further back. Both had most of the night on the road and went at a quick step. The object was arithmetic, every man in the right field, in the right order, before the hour set for the attack. Ahead even of the outposts, Patrols were marking 16 places where the German wire would have to be cut. A party of officers went out with a tape and laid the line the attack would start from. They measured and pegged in an uncanny quiet and were back before the guns opened. At 11:30, the heavy corps and army artillery began, from the Meuse across to the Argonne, on the two German lines in front of the sector. In places, the infantry was walking level with the batteries as they fired. Most of these men had never been near guns of that caliber at work. The noise splitting the darkness, the red glow, the sour smoke lying under the trees. Nobody stopped. The columns went past the camouflaged heavy pieces without breaking step, and the sound swallowed every other sound on the road. At 2:30, the divisional guns came in on top of the heavy ones, about 2,700 pieces along the whole American front. The night turned red, then dull as the smoke settled lower. Rockets went up in the blackness, went out, and were repeated. What had been individual guns became one long roll, and it ran for 3 hours. At 5:30, it did not stop. The noise slackened a little because most of the guns were lifting onto targets further north, and on the ground below the hill it thickened instead. There the fire stayed close in on the enemy's forward line for another 25 minutes. 20 seconds before the hour, trench mortars laid a curtain of smoke and fire across no man's land. The infantry went at 5:30, with 10 to 15 meters between one man and the next, and nothing much to look at ahead of them. The written order was to come within 300 meters of the barrage and follow it as closely as possible. The first 25 minutes were for cutting the wire, getting through it, and being ready to step over the first enemy line. Then the barrage began to move north, in bounds of 100 meters every 4 minutes. In the hour before the infantry moved, the heaviest fog of the season came down on the valley of the Ayres, and it lay in the low ground exactly where the attack was going to start from. At first it looked like a gift. It would hide the men going forward from the machine gunners on the slopes. Very soon it was plain that keeping touch would be nearly impossible. There was nothing to steer by. The march went on the compass, 30 degrees west of north, for hours. The squad walking ahead would go out of sight in a moment, and what was left was an opaque gray wall. It was possible to see 40 yards at times. Past that, the fog shut in. At 25 yards, it was already impossible to tell your own people from the enemy's. The gunners had been told to put smoke at the foot of the hill at Vauquois to cover the advance. Nobody had known about the fog, and the smoke made it deeper. Vauquois had been arranged for in advance. 5 hours ahead of the attack, every American trench on the hill was given up, and a heavy concentration was laid on the hill itself, gas and smoke shell among it, which kept the garrison below ground and the observers there with nothing to look at. The hill is under 1,000 feet long. At 8:15, an airman dropped a message over a divisional headquarters. He had been across the sector and had not been able to find the line at all. Down in the valley at about 8, the fog stood as it had stood at dawn, and a headquarters party that reached the road towards Varennes could fix its position for the first time. The ground did the rest. In the wood at Meuse-Argonne there was old wire and new wire, heavy undergrowth, and the craters of nearly 4 years of shelling, one lying into the next. Country like that brings a man on foot down to a crawl. An extra minute per 100 meters had been written into the timetable for it, and it was not enough. About 3 kilometers past the first German position, the leading regiment walked out of the trees into a clearing almost a mile across. with the ground rising to more trees on the far side. It was held at the edge of that opening for close to 5 hours. A captured German map afterward showed 113 fixed machine guns in front of it. In the next regiment zone, the smoke and the fog lay in the ravines and would not lift. Units mixed into one another, and the front line walked past machine gun nests without making them out in the murk. In the first half light, there was no enemy to be seen at all, only the guns going steadily behind. By about 10, the fog began to lift, though not everywhere at once. On the right, the division nearest the river was at Meuse-Argonne, where an undamaged German battery had been taken standing. Below the hill, the leading lines came out of the wood about 11, and the division beyond them had gone more than 3 miles. At Varennes that day, a tank corporal named Donald Call had half the turret of his tank taken off by a direct hit. He got clear, then went back to it under fire for the other man of his crew. The town was taken in part that afternoon, with the river running below it. Montfaucon had looked down on the fighting in front of it since 1914. At about 6 in the evening, 2 divisions went at it across open ground swept by machine gun fire, with tanks and with no artillery support at all. They reached the slope. Then the light went, and the attack was stopped where it stood. The night line ran roughly a mile beyond Cheppy on the west, and took in Danvaux and the wood at Meuse-Argonne on the east. About 5 miles had been made on either side of the hill that day. At the far left, inside the forest, it was about a mile. The hill in the middle was still held. Rain came with the second morning. The fight for the hill was taken up again at first light on the 27th. One division coming at it from the flank, the other at the front. By about noon of that second day, the last machine gun post on the top had been put out, and the men standing there were Americans, using it to watch from. That afternoon, the whole of the divisional artillery, less a few heavy batteries, got itself across no man's land and back into position behind the infantry. On the 28th, a counterattack was beaten off in the morning, and by midday, Charpentry, Bonny, and the wood at Montroubaud had been taken, 5.5 miles from where that division started. By the evening of the 28th, the deepest point of the advance stood 11 kilometers from the line the army had left on the 26th. On the 29th, the division on the far left came out onto a line beyond Aprumont. That night, 2 of the divisions that had opened the battle were taken out, and 2 others put into their places in the dark. Behind the advancing line lay a belt of ground that had been shelled for 4 years. And across that belt there were 4 roads. The violent artillery fire of the earlier years had all but destroyed them, and what was left of them ran through soil that had been turned over so often it took a wheel like a sponge. Material to mend them with was short. The critical problem of the first few days of the battle was the restoration of communication across no man's land. Everything the army was going to do next depended on it. Food, ammunition, and guns had to go forward over that belt. Vehicles had to come back over it, and the width of the whole operation was the width of what those 4 roads would carry in a day. Weather made it worse, and the enemy shelled the crossings, and the work went to whichever road the corps could least afford to lose that day. In one of the corps, a single main road, from Clermont up to Varennes, was supplying the entire corps, with 3 divisions standing in the line ahead of it. Everything those 3 divisions needed came up that one road. South of Varennes, and again south of Bouroy, 2 mine craters sat in the middle of it. Each was about 100 feet across and 40 to 50 feet deep, and each was placed where nothing could be got round without work. a detour had to be built up on one side, while a bridge was made over the whole. Clearing them properly took days. There was a rule for convoys, and the rule was sensible. Every 10th truck carried a red disc, and no vehicle was to close up nearer than a set number of yards behind it, so that after every 10th truck there was a gap in the column. An ambulance or a staff car that had to get past a block could use those gaps, one after another, and work its way through. What the road actually looked like was miles of a continuous line of motor vehicles, with practically no space between any of them. The gaps closed. Once the column became one body, it moved as one body, which is to say that it did not move. Traffic was sometimes completely blocked for hours, and once, in the early days, ambulances stood practically at a standstill for 24 hours. An ambulance is a useful thing to measure a road with, because an ambulance was supposed to be the one vehicle a jam made room for. They had the right of way to the rear. Even with that advantage, they could make no headway against the congestion, and a machine that is entitled to pass and cannot pass is a fair description of the whole week. The surgeon of one corps went out on that road himself. He took 2 other officers, drove as far as the traffic let him drive, and then walked the last half-kilometer into Neuville. Because ahead of the car the road was filled with an unbroken line of vehicles that looked, from where he stood, to run for miles. In 3 or 4 hours the car had not moved 100 yards. Nothing anyone could do had any noticeable effect on it. There were military police out, and traffic control posts, and constant supervision, and the jams occurred anyway. At night, the whole of it moved without lights, trucks, ambulances, wagons, and marching troops in the same darkness. And at intervals, the enemy dropped shells on the important crossroads. When it did move, a convoy went at 18 kilometers an hour with 60 feet between vehicles. Driving in it was the hardest driving there was. A light car worked through the maze by ducking between convoys, keeping clear of the staff cars and clear of the big ammunition trucks, and above all not stopping, because a vehicle that stopped was itself a block, and the block would stand behind it for as long as it took. Part of it was settled by leaving things where they stood. The army hospitals were kept back on the sites they had started on, in spite of the advance, until repair of the roads and railways loosened the traffic enough to move them forward. There were stretches in those weeks when a round trip for an ambulance ran 60 or 70 miles. The infantry felt it as an absence. Men who had stopped for the night wherever the end of the day had found them waited for the rolling kitchens, which after dark no longer had to be held back out of sight of the enemy's artillery, and which were somewhere behind them on the same road as everything else. The late September air was cold, and the ground they lay on was cold. At the front of all this, the effect showed up on the second day. Less ground was taken and held on the 27th than on the 26th. The first day's advance had been quick enough to run out ahead of a good part of its own artillery, and the short delay at the hill had given the enemy time to strengthen the ground north of it. By the afternoon of the 27th, the divisional guns were across and firing again, and on the 28th, with more artillery and more tanks, the line went forward about 1 3/4 miles along the whole front of the attack. By evening, everywhere except inside the forest, it stood past the 2nd German position and up against the outpost zone of the 3rd, the Hindenburg Line. On the 29th it stopped. Attempts to go on were met with heavy artillery concentrations and with counterattacks by German divisions that had just arrived. By the end of the 5th day, 7 more of them had been brought in from other parts of the Western Front. Gains were made here and there, but they were isolated, and they had to be given up again. That day, the army ordered the positions it held to be organized for defense, and preparations begun in earnest for taking the attack up again soon. This was not a rest. The line stayed where it was, the guns registered on new ground, and the whole weight of the operation shifted for a few days from the front of the corridor to the roads behind it. Some of the divisions that had made the first attack and had never been in a battle before it were taken out and replaced by divisions with previous battle experience. 2 came out on the night of the 29th. On the night of the 1st of October, another went, and the division that had gone 5.5 miles on the 28th handed over a line that was standing at Bonny. Tanks went out of the Somme differently. They went one at a time, and they were not replaced. The army had started the offensive with 415 of them, 141 of those with American crews. By the end of the first 2 weeks, there were about 94 still running. For 4 days, the shape of the thing did not change. The corridor was as deep as the roads had let it become, and it was going to stay that deep until the belt behind it carried more than it was carrying. On the 4th of October, at 5:30 in the morning, the attack was taken up again, behind the infantry, in the dark. Other men were making the ground passable. The belt they worked in was 3 or 4 miles wide, and for 4 years nothing in it had been kept up except what served a military purpose. A road there meant a line on the map and a row of holes where the line ran. Everything going forward now had to go over them. The columns came out after dark and went at the pace of whatever was slowest in front. Convoys came up from Dombasle and Rampon with ammunition, rations, and engineer material, unloaded at the dumps in the woods, and turned around for more. Between them, the engineers had the road to themselves for a few minutes at a time, and those minutes were their working day. Darkness made the repair work slower rather than quicker. An engineer could not see where the broken stone was lying, and he could not see the hole it was needed in. He found both by walking and by feel. Work that would have taken an hour in daylight took most of a night, and the column did not stop while it went on. Between the surges of movement, the men slept where they sat, on limbers and on the tailboards of trucks. When the column jammed, they were called down to it, and they put their shoulders against the wheels and pushed with everything they had. And when the wheels turned, they climbed back up. That went on through 3 days and 3 nights at the end of September. What went into the road was whatever lay beside it. Timbers were pulled out of the dugouts that had been left behind. Stones were dug out of the ground with bare hands, carried to the soft places and dropped in. Nothing was hauled up from a depot for this. The road was mended out of the field it ran through. A truck that broke down stayed where it stopped. Pulling it clear meant halting everything behind it, and everything behind it was miles long. So it was pushed to the side or into the ditch, and the column went around. Wagons and limbers went the same way. They were the losses of the road march, and there were a great many of them. The ground itself had been worked on from both sides for years. The Germans had blown bridges and broken the roads as they went back. The bombardment before the attack had put craters in them and brought trees down across them. 4 years of shelling had done the rest, and none of it had been repaired, because nobody had needed to drive here. Heavy trucks and gun wheels cut deep ruts into country lanes very quickly. Floods had washed out whole stretches, and embankments had settled into the marsh, so that a truck spinning its wheels went down to the hubs. Where shoulders at the wheel were not enough, a cable was run out, and the load was dragged forward by another engine. The size of what used these roads is easier to hold as a length. An American infantry division on the march, its trucks, its wagons, its ambulances, its supply and ammunition and sanitary trains, stretched 30 miles along a road. 650 trucks were allowed to a division by the tables. That is one division moving. Some of the load came off the roads and went onto rails laid for the purpose. Across the whole of France and across the whole war, American engineers built 125 miles of narrow-gauge track, the rails set about 2 feet apart. 406 narrow-gauge locomotives were shipped over for those lines, and rather more than 2,300 cars. The figure belongs to France entire, and not to this corridor. In front of Auvecourt, the narrow gauge was worked by mules. A train went back and forth all night between the camp at the rear and the village, carrying engineer material first, ammunition second, and rations third, in that order, until German shells put the forward end of the line out of use. About 100 donkeys, led up by the men of a wagon company, took what they could the rest of the way north. On the 29th of September, it began to rain in the wood below Montfaucon, and the forest floor softened under it. A 4-mile stretch of trees stood between the men who had gone forward and the transport that had not. The engineers dug and cut roots and cut saplings to lay a corduroy road across it. They had eaten nothing since morning, and they worked through that night and the whole of the next day. 2 divisions had been given the same road out of Bétancourt, and the jam on it began to matter. The commander of one of them did not send the question up to the corps. His men had spades, and they built a road of their own, straight over the height called Mortholm, and had it finished while the question would still have been traveling up and back through a headquarters. A little to the east, the engineers of another division had a bridge over the Forts Brook by 9 in the morning, and the artillery went across it. Throwing a bridge over a stream in daylight inside artillery range is a small piece of work with a fixed price. The guns that crossed at 9 were firing that afternoon from ground they could not otherwise have reached. By the beginning of October, the work was being written down and issued as orders. On the 3rd, the headquarters of the 1st Division put out a plan for engineers, attached to the field order for the attack. Which units would work, what was to be done in preparation, and what during the attack itself, and which roads were to be kept open. 1 battalion of the division's engineer regiment took the most forward road and bridge work, the part that moved with the infantry. A second held the roads and bridges behind it, bringing them up to what the division's own guns needed, then taking over the forward work as the first went on ahead. 3 companies of a pioneer regiment worked alongside them. 2 roads were named for repair. One was a national route running north out of Varennes. The other came up from Cheppy through a string of villages and farms as far as Saumarons, and the order fixed one fork along it by map coordinate rather than by name. When the general advance began again on the 4th of October, the roads in the zone were, in the official phrase, practically being rebuilt as they were used. The weather was against it, the shelling was frequent, and there were not enough engineer and pioneer troops to go round. None of those 3 conditions changed much in the weeks that followed. This is what set the pace of the offensive. A division could go forward as far as its rations and its ammunition could follow it. They followed it on wheels, and wheels need a surface. How far the army got in a day was settled some miles behind the front by men with spades, working in the dark. Toward morning, the traffic thinned and the road showed what had been done to it. Fresh stone pressed into the ruts, timber across the soft places, a shoulder cut back where a wagon had gone off. None of it would last. The rain would come, and the next column, and the same work would be done again the following night. The forest was not in the plan, a place to be taken. The intention was to drive hard in the center and to have the French army be on the far side come on at the same time, so that the enemy would have to leave the forest without a heavy attack in that difficult region. What happened instead was that a division went into the trees and stayed there 3 weeks. On the 26th of September, the 77th Division came out of the French trenches, crossed the old no-man's land, and went in among the timber. It held the left of the American line. The front it started from was about 5 miles wide, and the ground in front of it was the forest, which nothing on wheels could enter. Inside, a company could not spread out. The undergrowth was thick enough that even a squad could not be pushed wider than a single man. So a company that had begun the offensive at 150 and was down to 90 by its 4th day went forward in a file longer than any front it could show. The officer at the head of it broke the way with his elbows, holding vines aside, going round the thickets that could not be pushed through, and now and then bending under an arch of branches grown together overhead. He kept his direction by compass. There was no sky to check it against, and nothing in front of him that had a name. Nothing on wheels came in behind them either. There were no roads by which ration carts and ammunition carts could follow, so cartridges and food were carried in by hand, along paths that were remembered rather than marked. The artillery could not help. It was a kind of fighting in which a battalion had what it had carried in. The map was still correct, and it had stopped being useful. It could give a direction, and the compass could hold it, but it could not say what stood in the next 30 yards, and 30 yards was as far as a man could see. 2 units a few hundred yards apart could pass a day without knowing where the other was. The German machine guns in the timber were worked by a method rather than by weight of fire. A gun would put out 75 or 100 rounds and then stop, and after that it fired only when it had something to fire at. Silence from a position did not mean the position had been left. Machine gun parties worked in behind the leading battalion of one of the division's regiments on the 28th of September. Along the line its messages traveled and cut it off for a time. The regiment's second in command went forward to rebuild the chain of runners and get cartridges and rations through, and was killed doing it. The next day support came up and the advance went on. By the 1st of October, the line in front of the division was not giving anywhere, and an order went out that each attacking unit was to push on by itself, without regard to what its flanks were doing. In open country, that would have been a reckless order. Here it only put into words what the ground had been enforcing since the first morning. 6 companies from 2 battalions went forward on the 2nd of October and took the objective given them, a stretch of road a little east of the mill at Charlevoix. A company from the neighboring regiment came in on their right, and 2 machine gun companies with them. Together it was about 550 men under a major named Whittlesey, and they were where they had been told to be. What was to come up on either side of them did not come. During the night the machine gun parties closed the ground behind them, and from the morning of the 3rd of October, the official record has them cut off and surrounded by superior numbers. They held the ground they had taken. They stayed on it 5 days. Supply was the whole of it. They had gone in with what a man carries, and there had been one ration among 4 days even before the ring closed. For more than 100 hours, nothing came through to them. Water came out of shell holes. There was nothing to spend but what was in their pockets. Aircraft were sent to find them and to drop food under a closed roof of branches from any height at which an aeroplane can fly. One small position looks like the rest of the forest, and the aviators had great difficulty finding them. One of the company commanders went out into open ground to signal to them, and was decorated for it afterwards. A written proposition to surrender was carried in on the 4th day. It was declined, and it was declined by not being answered. Nothing was sent back. Attacks came in on the position from every side, day after day, and they went on that afternoon exactly as they had gone on that morning. Outside the ring, attempts to break through were made every day, and every day the machine guns held. On one of those days, the brigade commander mounted 5 attacks and led 2 himself, having turned down an offer of help from outside, since it was the division's own business. How many attempts were made altogether nobody afterwards could say. An attack came in from the flank near Châtel-Chéry on the morning of the 7th of October, made by 2 other divisions, while the 77th pushed up from the south. It was the sideways pressure that told. That evening, men of the regiment on the right worked through the machine gun line and reached the position. A runner came into the post at about 1 in the morning carrying a small sack of bread and 2 tins of corned beef. A patrol had got through with what little it could carry. 5 days of it, and the meaning of the relief arrived in a man's hands in that form. The official order, signed the following April by the division commander, gives the count. Of the roughly 550, 194 officers and men were able to walk out when the relief came. Those killed were numbered at 107. The order names the units, gives the dates, and says nothing else. The division did not stop when the ring was broken. It had been in the forest since the 26th of September, and went on clearing it, in rain that had not let up, on rations that came forward by hand along the same paths as before. Over the next 2 days, what was left of the German line among the trees came apart. The weather turned on the 9th of October. Under a warm sun, the division made more than 6 miles in 2 days, and by the 10th, the forest was in American hands from end to end. Its own history records 10,000 French civilians left behind the advance. In villages the division had reached from the south for the first time. On the 12th, the Corps commander put on record that the division had been continuously in action since the night of the 25th of September. That was 18 days. He wrote that its conditions had been at least as difficult as those of any division in the army. In the 3 weeks between the 26th of September and the 16th of October, the division's own history counts 3,697 of its men killed, wounded, and missing. Over those same weeks, it had come 14 miles through the trees and had met 5 different German divisions. A man who came out of that forest and looked afterwards at a map of it would have found nothing on it that was wrong. The streams were where it put them, and the roads around the edges ran where it said they ran. It had simply not been a map of anything he needed to know, and for 3 weeks he had steered by compass instead. At the end of September, the army stopped where it had got to. The order was to consolidate the ground already taken and prepare to go on. Divisions that had opened the attack, in action for the first time in their lives, came out of the line, and divisions that had fought before replaced them. Rain came with the month. The cold October rains began early, and after that there was little fair weather to expect. Men had gone into the attack without blankets, so that they could move faster, and now they lay on wet ground at night and shivered. When it did not rain, a cold fog came down and stayed until morning. The general attack was taken up again at dawn on the 4th of October, along the whole width of the corridor at once. One division took a wood called Bois de Foist in the fortified belt southeast of Cunel. Another worked north along the little river Ayres. Both gains fitted into one line of a report, and both took the whole day. What stood in front of them was the fortified belt itself, the Hindenburg Line. It followed the crests to the north, through the woods above Cunel and across the high ground at Romagnoux, and it had been dug and wired and concreted while the front here stood still. It was not a trench to be crossed and left behind, but a band of ground whose guns covered every way in. On the 8th of October, the attack was widened east of the river. A French corps went in there with 3 of its own divisions and 2 American ones, took part of the heights on that bank, and by the end of the day had about 3,000 prisoners. The slopes there were the same yellow clay, and the rain was on them too. That same morning, west of the river near Châtel-Chéry, a small party from a support platoon of the 82nd Division was sent round a hill to put down the machine guns on it. The Germans holding that ground belonged to a reserve division. By the report written afterwards, 132 prisoners went back to the rear from it. The corporal in the party was named Alvin York. The report gives the number and the units and stops there. The corps in the center attacked again on the 9th. 2 divisions drove a wedge into the belt in the woods above Cunel, and a 3rd came up south of Romagnoux. On the 10th, the attacks ran the whole width of the army front. A day later, one division deepened the wedge in the Bois de Forêt. Another reached the forward positions of the belt east of Saint-Jouvin. Many places changed hands more than once in the same day. A wood taken in the morning was lost in the afternoon, and taken again before dark, and the line at nightfall was the line of the morning with 100 meters added. On the 12th, the fighting died down. The belt had been broken on a stretch of about 3 miles. That was the measure of the month. Ground was not won in days here. It was won in slopes, the near face of a ridge, then the crest, then the reverse slope, and then the next ridge standing behind it, which from below looked like the one before. A division could spend a week on 2 of them. 17 German divisions stood in the front line on this stretch by the middle of the month, with 6 more in reserve behind them. They were not the same 17 from one week to the next. Divisions came in, wore down and went out, and the belt they were holding stayed exactly where it was. The high ground went at last on the 14th. The 32nd Division took Côte d'Armorié, the hill that commands the country west of Romagnoux. The 77th took Saint-Jouvin, and the 82nd the ridge east of the village. All of it lay inside the fortified belt, and all of it had been looked at from below for days. Dame Marie did not fall to the attack that went straight at it. The artillery preparation had not cut the wire in front of one of the attacking regiments, and the men there could not get through. What settled the hill was a company working round one flank, while a second force came round the other, until the ground between them stopped being worth holding. Romagnoux itself was taken in pieces. A battalion came at the village from the front. A 2nd regiment went round it to the south, until it was nearly encircled. and other companies cleared it afterwards. About 200 prisoners were taken there. The name had stood in the corps objectives for 2 weeks. The fighting lasted a morning. Over the 15th and 16th, the 42nd Division took Côte de Châtillon, a strong point of the belt to the west, and the 82nd took the height north of Saint-Jouvent. The divisional history counts the fighting for Châtillon as 2 days out of all the weeks that division spent in the sector. The rest was moving up, waiting on the guns, lying out in the rain. One more hill stood in front of Châtillon, and it went the way the others had. A company came out of the woods at Romagnoux under a barrage at 10:30 and started up the slope. Its captain saw that one patch of wood on the approach was drawing no fire and sent a platoon into it. It came out behind the main point of resistance, unseen. Through all of this, the divisions on the eastern side used a German narrow-gauge line as their axis. The Decauville track ran across the sector on its little rails, and it appears in the divisional record again and again as a boundary and an objective. It was the one straight thing in a country of slopes and woods. On the 21st, Pershing ordered preparation for another general attack. The date set provisionally for the 28th, with local attacks first to clear the ground the army would start from. Those went in over the next 2 days. Fresh divisions came into the line at Romagnoux and east of the river. One finished taking the Bois de Forêt. Another cleared the heights at Cunel. A third the northern and eastern parts of the Romagnoux heights. The wooded belt north of Grand Pré, at the northwestern corner of the corridor, was on the same list, and there it went on almost without a pause. The 78th Division attacked day after day through the end of the month, in a place where the ground favored the defense and the weather favored nobody. The town changed hands by degrees, and the counting was done in orchards. By the history it wrote afterwards, the 32nd Division, which had taken Dame Marie, set its own total for the campaign at 6,046. That is one division out of the 22 American divisions and 4 French ones that passed through the corridor between the end of September and the 11th of November. Rain had settled in for good by the last days of October. Behind the front, the traffic was what it had been all month, and the men in the line stood on ground they had looked up at from below a week earlier. Ahead of them, the belt was broken in places and unbroken in others, and the next ridge stood where it always had. A truck stood on a road a few miles behind the front, with a winch bolted to its bed. From the drum, a steel cable ran up at an angle into the morning. At the top of it hung a bag of gas about 200 feet long and 50 through, shaped like a sausage. Under the bag hung a basket, and in the basket there was a man. He sat at about 2,000 feet, and the height was fixed by the load in the basket. A single observer went higher than a pair of them. The truck stood a few miles behind the line, close enough that the cable reached and far enough that the enemy's field guns did not. On a quiet front, it could be worked further out. Along the front, they stood every 15 or 20 miles, on the German side as well as ours. Those distances were set by where the guns were. When an attack was coming and the enemy artillery had plainly been put down, it could be brought closer. Nothing else about it could be changed. It went where its truck's road went and no further. The cable was the whole arrangement. It carried the telephone wire, held the balloon at the height decided for it, and made escape impossible. A balloon under attack from the air could not go anywhere quickly. The answer to shell fire was not to come down. The truck drove a little way along the road with the balloon still up, and later drove again. sometimes back near where it started. In the basket, the observer had telephone receivers pressed to his ears and a glass at his eye. He talked down to the officers at the truck, and they told him what was wanted that hour. The telephone was the normal means, and the line was laid so he could speak straight to the battery, whose fire he corrected. Wireless was kept for when it failed. The work itself was patient. When his own battery fired on a position he could see, he waited for the shells, told the battery where they had gone, and waited again. When the guns were working over a road, he watched it and said when the damage was enough to stop traffic. One ranging meant every round fired at one target. Some of the country was always hidden. Even at full height there was ground behind a crest or in a fold that no observer could see from that point. For every ascension point he used, the company commander drew up a plan showing what could be seen from it and what could not, and sent it down to the command and to the artillery. Between the balloon and the aeroplane, the work was divided along that same line. The balloon took general observation and the ranging of fire on what lay within its view. For what it could not see, it was still good for a rough ranging that an aeroplane finished. Both answered to the same air service officer. So the two halves of the picture came to one desk. What stopped all of it was the weather. The instructions set a limit for wind of about 18 meters a second and 20 when an attack was going in. Above that, nothing went up. Rain and a low ceiling ended a day just as completely, and they came round more often than the wind did. Over this campaign, the weather was against the work almost from beginning to end. From the middle of September to the 11th of November, conditions were on the whole unfavorable. Cloud and fog covered the ground nearly every morning and again in the afternoon, and through the last 4 weeks, a haze lay over the sector early and late. So the flying was done through gaps. Crews stood by their machines ready to go at the first sign of the sky lifting. When pictures were badly wanted, sorties went out in weather where failure was close to certain, on the chance of a break over the line, and often enough it came. The whole front was never once photographed as the troops moved. Printing was the part nobody had planned for. In the first weeks of the offensive, a photographic section took on mass printing never intended for it, and turned out 56,000 prints in 4 days. The job was formally handed to the sections, and within a week 3 base laboratories were standing. In the few clear days before the attack of the 1st of November, 2 sections of one group produced 10,000 prints in a day. The camera itself changed in this battle. An automatic plate camera called the Durham, chosen more than a year earlier, was used in action here for the first time. With it, the observer no longer sat doubled up in the fuselage changing plates and timing exposures by hand. He could look at the ground with his own eyes. There were never as many balloon companies as the plan called for. When the fighting stopped, 35 were at work in France, 12 at artillery ranges and schools in the rear, 6 on their way up, the rest at the front with the 2 armies. 15 worked with the army in this battle, and 2 of those were French. The danger came with the job, and it is in the record as a count rather than as a story. Enemy aircraft burned a number of the American balloons over the course of the war, and fire from the ground accounted for others. None of that altered the day's work. The truck stood on its road, the cable ran up, and the man in the basket looked north. An observer new to the work could not be sent straight to a basket. He went first to a company at the front and spent 3 or 4 weeks there. learning the country from a height before anyone asked him to correct fire over it. The ground below a balloon looks like nothing in particular, until a man has seen it every day for a month. Over the sector, the aeroplanes had spent the weeks before the attack keeping out of sight. Newly arrived American Corps squadrons were forbidden to fly over the new ground at all, so that nothing in the air would show that anything below had changed. The routine reconnaissance, photography, and ranging stayed with the French squadrons long stationed there. American observers learned the country as passengers behind French pilots. On the first morning, the whole pursuit group was given one task: low-flying aircraft and the enemy's balloons. 10 of those balloons were brought down that day, and the rest were attacked so steadily afterwards that they were of little use. Whole groups went up together at an hour and place chosen from what the other side was expected to do. At night from above, the guns below made a line of flashes that never quite stopped, and their sound was lost inside the noise of the engine. A searchlight burned through every night flight, its beam standing straight up. It could be seen for many miles over the other side's country, and was the mark the crews came home on. By last light, the cable came in on the drum, the bag came down onto the road, and the crew folded it. The plan of what could be seen from that point stayed where it had been sent, at the battery and at headquarters, and the ground it did not cover stayed as it was, out of sight behind its own hill. Guns moved at night more often than by day, and the food and the ammunition came up the same roads after dark. A battery on the march was horses, drivers, the piece itself, the caisson behind it, and the men who would serve it walking alongside. 4 guns and their crews made a battery, and a captain commanded it. Almost every one of those guns was French. In June of 1917, it had been settled that America's own artillery would stay at home for training, and that troops in France would be armed in French and British calibers instead. Guns for the first divisions were bought from the Allies, and steel and copper went back the other way in exchange to be made into replacements. When war was declared, the country had light artillery enough for an army of 500,000 men, and the task in front of it was to arm 5 million. The difference was made up abroad. About 100 American-made guns took part in this battle. Everything else on the line, light and heavy, had come to its crews through somebody else's arsenal. A gunner mostly did not see what he was firing at. The target reached him as a map reference and a line in a table of times, worked out by somebody else, and he served the piece to that table. Whether the shells arrived where they were wanted came back to him afterwards, from an observer he had never met. The horizon was where his work stopped being his. For the battle itself, the War Department statistical summary of 1919 counted 2,417 guns used in the offensive and 4,214,000 rounds fired from them. Both come from the same table, and the second covers the whole 47 days of the battle, from the first preparation to the last morning. The largest single count of guns in this battle belongs to that opening, and it stands in the record as a number and nothing else. Nobody on the ground counted it. A gunner knew the pieces on either side of his own, and the sound, which arrived as one sound and did not separate again. A preparation was never one thing. Wire had to be cut. Behind the wire there was harassing fire, destructive fire, fire against the enemy's own batteries, and fire laid across the roads and tracks in his rear. All of it was written out beforehand, hour by hour, in the orders of each division, with the tasks parceled out among named regiments and timed to the minute. When the infantry moved, the fire moved ahead of it in bounds, on a timetable set before anyone stepped off. In one division's order, the barrage stood 25 minutes on the forward trenches, 10 on the intermediate position, and 20 on the second. 200 meters beyond it, a covering fire went the whole way as well. The allotment for that morning fills a page of the order. American and French light regiments, one of them motorized, came to 23 batteries. The heavy artillery was an American field regiment, a French regiment, 2 batteries of coast artillery working heavy trench mortars, and a mortar battalion of 12 pieces. All of that supported one division. None of it had been ranged in. Battery commanders received their table of barrages and their list of targets, and fired on the map, trusting to observers who had never been in action, and to airmen who had never ranged guns in an operation of this size. 4 of the 9 divisions attacking that morning had divisional artillery they had never worked with before. And some brigades had drawn their guns at a training camp and come straight up. Then the guns had to follow the infantry. The ground between the old lines had been nobody's for 4 years, soaked, grown over with weeds, cut by ditches and small streams. At every one of them the wheels went in. Teams were tired before the battle began, and horses were short everywhere. So the officers' riding horses went into harness, and the horses of the mounted details with them, and the piece came out and went on to the next ditch. By 8 o'clock on the first morning, out of one whole brigade, a single battery had reached a new position, the northern edge of a small wood called Rossignol. From that hour the division's infantry went forward with almost none of its own artillery behind it, and the guns spent the day on the roads rather than in action. The road that should have carried them was not available. A bridge on it had been blown at Bouroy, and further along a mine crater took up the whole width of the way. That left one route out of Neuville, the track marked on the map as the axis of liaison, the division's main supply artery. It was a bad road, and everything the division owned went up it. Where the engineers had not yet come, each battery and each column opened its own passage and left the one behind to do the same again. Embankment slid into the marsh, and a truck that lost its grip went into the hubs. When shoulders were not enough and a gun went off into the ditch, the drag ropes came out and the teams pulled it back. A column also had to find the unit it was feeding, and the position it was looking for had usually moved. In one division, 100 pack donkeys turned out to be the most useful thing on the ammunition run, because they went where wheels would not. By the second day, the supply of shells was already short of what the guns wanted. One brigade's own account keeps a running total. Between the 26th of September and the first days of October, in the Argonne, it fired nearly 80,000 shells. Most of that went on the opening morning, when the 75s alone accounted for more than 37,000 rounds. The rest was spread thin over the week after. Work went on through the nights without a break, to keep the guns firing where they stood, and to move them to places from which they would be effective. Rations and ammunition came up in the dark. A gunner could stay at it longer than an infantryman could, and men not on watch took what sleep they could get. There was an order that divisional artillery would not fire at targets outside its own divisional sector. On the 28th of September, the commander of the American forces came to one division's headquarters, and the order was discussed there. The flanking fire coming into that division was falling from the forest on its left, and from Aprechmon, beyond the boundary. On the 1st of November, the guns worked 2 hours before the infantry moved, and light pieces went forward with the leading troops as accompanying guns. The artillery of a single division was to fire more than 68,000 rounds in that 24 hours. The artillery of divisions in reserve and at rest had been brought up to the line to help with it. The truck columns carrying shells up for that day seemed to have no end, and heaps of ammunition grew along the roadsides. Afterwards, the infantry went on by lorry, and the guns pressed after them by country lanes. The heavy pieces were sighted to reach the railway between Grignon and Sedan, and the junctions at Longillon and Conflans. Names on a map and nothing a gunner would ever see. At night, the same road carried movement in both directions. Guns, shells, and rations went up it. The cars came back down it. Where the two met, what was going forward had the road first, and the cars going to the rear stood at the verge until it had passed. Everything else worked inside that rule. The chain began at the point where a man went down. First aid was given there, by the regimental medical personnel, or by men detailed from the fighting units for the work, and from there he was carried back to the battalion aid post. That post was the first place in the system with a name and a map location. At the aid post, the diagnosis tag was made out and tied on, written by the first medical officer through whose hands the man passed, and it went with him the whole distance afterwards. From there, the litter bearers of the sanitary company took him onto the ambulance dressing station, which was the first point a motor car could reach. That station stood at the forward limit of what a car could be driven to with reasonable safety, and no further. The limit moved as the line moved. Here it was settled which hospital each man was going to, and the car took him to that hospital and no other. Where a dugout was available, the station used it. Nothing went back without something coming forward. The bearers who had brought a man down carried up with them an exact replacement for everything spent on him, so that a forward post was never emptied by its own work. Whatever else the medical people up front wanted came up the same way, and they were asked to put the request in writing. Cars were also stood out across the division's area as ambulance posts, so that units away from the axis had transport within reach. Every division ran a triage of its own as well: reception, classification, and distribution, which is all it covers. The institution had come from the French service and had been taken up throughout the American Army. Classification had 3 headings: those who could not be moved, those who could travel sitting, and those who had to travel lying. 3 of a division's 4 field hospitals were taken up by the triage while it was in action, and the officers put in charge were the best medical judgment the division had, with specialists beside them. The 4th hospital was held back, and its work was to move. It opened the new triage before the old one closed, so that for a while 2 sorting stations stood open at once, and the drivers went to the nearer of them. Then the station behind shut down, came forward, and became the one held in reserve. None of it was uniform, and the medical history says so in as many words. No single method was used everywhere, and no orders standardizing the procedure came down from above, except within corps and, more rarely, from the Army. Methods differed between divisions of one corps and sometimes between the regiments of one division. Each corps had a regulating officer, placed where he had a trunk telephone line to the chief surgeon of the Army. An officer of the corps ambulance train sat at every divisional triage and told him continuously how many men were waiting to go back, and the Army evacuation officer told him how many beds stood empty behind. Routes were few. One division's axis ran from Veyrie through the Bois de Cheppy to Avocourt and carried 3 divisions' traffic, one way only. The church at Neuville was taken as overflow when the field hospitals near it filled. Near Haute, a quarter of a kilometer of road was so heavily mined that traffic went round it over low wet ground. When the motors could not get through, horses went instead. Word that the cars were held brought horse wagons up, their advantage being that they could leave the road altogether and cross ground no car would attempt. Whatever went to the rear went loaded if it could. Lorries that had taken artillery ammunition up for one division carried men down from the dressing stations on the way back. On the 5th of November, 5 motor ambulances were dragged through a swamp by horses and by men, and ran on their own power once across. Where a stretch of road had gone entirely, the chain grew a link made of men, a post at each end of the broken piece, and 20 men detailed to carry across it to the cars on the far side. 2 days later, a halfway station was opened at Tannay, and a collecting point at Chemry, reached by driving part of the way along the railway. Cars had got into Sommerance for the first time on the 14th of October. They were mud from top to bottom, many without mud guards or side boxes, and filling the holes that overnight traffic had made was a standing duty of every section, done at first light. The Army summary counts the result. Its ambulances made more than 24,000 trips during the battle and carried some 73,000 men. The same cars carried doctors and nurses moving station with their baggage. A car did that work every night for 47 nights, and the summary is the only place it appears. Behind the cars was the rail. Trains loaded at the hospitals and railheads at Souilly and Vaubecourt, and empty beds were reported forward to the regulating station at Is-sur-Tille, and allotted from there to the station at Saint-Dizier. 20 American hospital trains were in service, and 45 more were hired from the French. The French ran the short hauls to the nearer base hospitals, and the American trains the long ones. 408 train trips were made during the operation. About 150,000 men went back by rail over those trips. The summary splits them into battle cases and medical cases. And the medical figure is the influenza, which began to rise in the last week of September, climbed through October and fell away in November. The epidemic was heavier in the middle phase of the operation than in the first or the last, and it threatened to disorganize the system altogether. Its cases were sorted with the same care as the others. The Army had no convalescent camp in its own area, and few beds close behind the line. So more men went down the chain than otherwise would have. Nothing here went into a report as an event. The cars ran without lights, going down while the guns went up, and turned at the far end and came back for the next load. In the morning the holes were filled. The forward stations moved a little further on, and the same work began again in the same order. A division comes out of the line in the dark, and not all at once. The forward elements are relieved first, and the last of them are still walking back a day or two afterwards, so there is no single hour anybody could write down for it. Then a march, or a train, and then a rest area, 100 kilometers and more behind the front. Everything that could be seen was done at night. The marching, the hauling, the reliefs, the pitching of tents, all of it went into the dark, because the dark was the only cover. A column at night moves at the speed of the road under it. Men doze upright between halts and wake when the man in front stops walking. In the villages, the men went into whatever had a roof, lofts, stables, sheds, outbuildings, where nothing was left standing. A knockdown barrack for about 100 men went up in a field. In some places, the billeting of the men coincided with that of the horses, the cows, and the chickens. A division history calls this an improvement, and against the line it was. A rest area was not always a village. One division came back into a wood and found dugouts for 2,400 men, and it had about 18,000. Many of the dugouts stood full of water. The divisional commander told his men to their faces, as a joke, that this was the worst district in France. Where the engineers had time, they built bathhouses, and the old clothing and everything living in it went out at one door, while new clothing and blankets came in at the other. In the field it was plainer. A man might get a bath. More often he got a change of underclothes or socks, perhaps once or twice in a month, because there was never enough to change into. Getting the clothing was one job and giving it out was another. Shirts, trousers, shoes, and socks come in sizes, and the sizes were what the company and regimental supply officers worked through, with very little sympathy from anyone. Re-equipping one division on the march took 150 truckloads in 3-ton lorries, 6,000 steel helmets among them, and of some things there were still not enough to go round. Out of the line, the standard was 2 hot meals a day, from kitchens sent forward to the unit. In a quiet trench sector, one division recorded an average of 1 meal a day, no water to wash in, and no issue of clothing at all. In the worst weeks, men lived on what they were carrying. All 3 of those are the same army, in different months. What a man carried was fixed: rifle, bayonet, steel helmet, gas mask, 250 rounds, some in the belt and the rest in 2 bandoliers across the shoulders. On his back, a pack holding his slicker, if he was not wearing it, a mess tin, and 2 days of the iron ration. His canteen held about a quart, and that was his water. The iron ration was 2 cans of corned beef and 6 boxes of hard bread. A thick cracker, edible and nourishing and very hard. The improved descendant of the hardtack of the Civil War. The reserve ration was a problem of packing. Its container either wetted through and opened easily to rats, or was too bulky to stow. Grenades came in 4 kinds, and most of them, by one account, were thrown away. Special details carried more. A shell for the trench mortar weighed 10 pounds and 11 ounces, and a man told off for that carried 4. Rain added to it. A long overcoat on the march soaks, and the wet skirts of it wrap round the legs and work against the step. On an iced road, a team loses its feet and goes down whole, and men put their shoulders under the guns on the rises. When a kitchen came up onto new ground, the first thing the mess sergeant did was try to get word to his own company, somewhere ahead of him. It did not often work, and only after it worked did a ration party go forward. The cooks made do with the wood they had, and wet green wood mattered. A poor fire is a late meal for 200 men. At night, a kitchen gave itself away by light rather than by smell. A field range on the move was bound to throw a shower of sparks, and by a certain point it no longer mattered. Firewood was a standing job. Parties went out daily into the forest under the eye of the French Forestry Service and brought back what was allowed them, to be split at the kitchens. The road up the corridor was held open by labor units, and it was the same working chain that began on the docks in the ports. Salvage parties went over the ground behind, picking up overcoats, blankets, rifles, gas masks, and what else had been put down. Animals were a daily procedure. A dipping vat was set up and every horse and mule went through it not less than 4 times. Then grooming, clipping, and better standings, and the 2 real difficulties were ground that drained and forage enough. Where there was pasture with soft grass in it, the change showed. Well-muscled, smooth-coated animals stood on picket lines that a few months before had barely carried a rider. Before an inspection, the gunners spent half the night getting mud off carriages and caissons and cleaning the horses. In one rest area, an artillery brigade got up a horse show, worked at it for weeks, and laid the ground out under the old trees of a park, where it could not be seen from the air. Gun crews decorated their positions and made a competition of that too. Polished brass shell cases packed with red poppies, or with blue and yellow flowers, set along the walls around the guns, and framed pictures and verses hung beside them. Mail came in when it came. Pay was no more regular than the mail, and without money a man could go to the moving pictures the Y put on, and could not buy cigarettes, gum, or pie. In one division history, the line that mail was beginning to be received from home stands by itself, a sign that things were coming right. A French Corps commander, under whom one American division was serving, drove out nearly every day to the wood where it was quartered and asked the officers the same questions each time. The food, the clothing, the mail, and whether the canteen and the newspapers were getting through. Pigeons traveled in cages and belonged to a loft in the rear. The message went in a metal capsule on the leg, and the loft telephoned it on. They stand in the signal tables beside the telephone, the radio, and the earth telegraph, and they broke down as everything else did. One bird came home with its capsule intact, and the loft never passed the message on to divisional headquarters. Sleep did not come back quickly. A day did not do it, or 2, or 3, or 10. Drill began again as soon as men had slept once, all the way through. In the line they slept where they were, among the guns, each man loading his rifle first and setting the safety, as ordered, off the road, in the thick shade under the trees. The ground never dried after rain, and that is where they lay. On the night of the 3rd of November, the Corps on the right came down onto 8 miles of the riverbank. The work was the same for every division the advance brought to the water in its turn. Patrols went out in the dark to feel for the gaps, and behind them the engineers built under what cover the guns could give. With darkness that night, the first crossings were tried. A footbridge went over the river without being noticed. On the canal the work was broken up, and the parties came back to it when the fire slackened. By 2 in the morning, 2 footbridges stood over the water. The order that came down on the 4th left nothing to arrange. At 4 in the afternoon, a pontoon bridge was begun at Clé-Ris-le-Petit, where the river runs 100 feet wide and 10 feet deep. At 20 minutes past 6, another party went over the canal, and the river at Briolle with no preparation fired for it. Below that village, a battalion crossed on rafts, on duckboards, on poles and ropes, and by swimming. The water was bitter cold, though by then every man in the corridor had given up expecting to be dry. The battalion that got over dug in a wood on the far bank and kept warm through the night by working. By 8 the next morning there were bridges at the village strong enough for artillery. The bridgeheads were joined, and the next thing on the list was Dun-sur-Meuse and the high ground above it. By the evening of the 4th the leading troops were at La Neuville, across the water from Stounay, and had come through the Forêt de Dieulay to the edge of Beaumont. On the 5th the advance went on without a check, and the corps on the right turned east and crossed the river. The pace cost the signal service everything. By the 6th, every element was down to the oldest method there is. Orders and information moved by courier, on foot, over broken ground, and slowly. The linemen would just about get the wire up to a divisional headquarters, and the headquarters would move on, and the work began again. The 1st Division had its order about Sedan on the afternoon of the 6th. The town lay ahead of the left of the advance, 7.5 miles from the Belgian frontier. Divisional headquarters that night was in an old camp behind the line, and the division was to march for the heights southwest of the town. It went in 5 columns and was clear of its ground between 7 and 8 in the evening. At night there is nothing to move on but roads. Rain came into packs already heavy, and made bad going worse for feet already bad, and men who had been marching and fighting for days had to be kept awake. The hours are in the record. One village at 3:30 in the morning, another at 4:30. A halt at a third until 7:30. A crossroads at 20 minutes to 8. All night the columns ran into another American division and into French troops on the same roads, passed through each other and went on. By the 7th, the line stood on the Meuse, and the left held the heights that looked down on Sedan. That was 41 kilometers, by the report of the American commander, from where they had started on the 1st of November. The railway through the town below them was what the whole operation had been aimed at since September. Through the 8th, 9th, and 10th, the corps on the right worked eastward, and a French corps with 3 American divisions in it pushed the enemy off his last hold on the heights east of the river. In the night of the 10th, the corps in the center crossed east of Beaumont and took the high ground inside the bend. At 6 in the morning on the 11th of November, notification came from Marshal Foch's headquarters that the armistice had been signed and that hostilities would cease at 11 o'clock. It went out to the troops as fast as it could be sent, which that week was not fast everywhere. At 9, the attack ordered the day before went in on the front of the 79th Division, and at 9:30, the infantry moved forward. At the same hour, the message went by telephone to the brigade commanders. At 11, the line would halt where it stood. No man moving a step either way. All firing would stop, and all ranks would dig in. From the brigades forward, it went by hand. Runners carried it out to the leading battalions across ground the wire had not reached, and the division's history notes that they knew what was in the message and went anyway. One regiment, already moving, had it at 16 minutes to 11. Fog lay over that ground all morning. It kept 2 machine gun companies from supporting the advance and spoiled the enemy's ranging at the same time. The ground was so soft with rain that shells went deep and threw up columns of water and mud where they burst. One regiment recorded that it had probably lost the last man killed in action on the Western Front at 1 minute to 11. The gunners spent the last 2 hours emptying what they had. Battery commanders tied lengths of wire into the lanyards so that a whole crew could take hold at once, and fired with their watches in their hands to give out everything before the hour and nothing after it. At 11 o'clock, the firing thinned and stopped. Men halted where they were and stood, and then, because those were the orders, they dug in. For the first minutes they held their breath and waited for it to start again. Only when the minutes went on passing and nothing came did it settle in them that it was not going to. There was no celebrating in the infantry. One division's history has its men standing almost stoical, while the gunners down in the valley made all the noise there was. Another records no jubilation at all, and a divisional headquarters gone oddly quiet. Men walking out of it as though out of a strange sleep. A third account has men simply angry at being stopped. It was not 11 o'clock everywhere. East of Beaumont, the advance had gone so fast, and getting a message across the river was so difficult that on isolated parts of that front the fighting went on past the hour among men who had not been told. What was different showed itself in small things. A man could put his head up without drawing a shot. He could stand full height on ground where he had spent days learning not to. The hole he was lying in stopped being the reason he was alive. And from behind, up the road, hot food was coming. Work went on. The forward positions had to be located on the map, written up and consolidated, and no time was set aside for anything else. By dusk the line was arranged and the men settled into it, knowing that nothing would come over in the night. Across the way, the enemy on the heights burned everything he had. Rockets and Veillerie lights went up all night, red and blue and green. The whole night signaling stock of the depots. Fires were lit on the high ground and down in the valley. Between them, for the first time, the ordinary noises of the night were all there was to listen to. The ground is still there, and most of it is farmland again. By the statistical summary the War Department published the year after, 150 villages and towns came back during those weeks. Places that had been on the other side of a line since 1914, and were suddenly on a road again. Some of them were heaps of brick when they were handed back. Malancourt was described, in the year of the fighting, as a heap of ruins. They were rebuilt where they had stood, with the same names. And the names are what the guidebooks still use to find the turnings. In 1922 the burials were gathered in. They came from the whole district, and from the Vosges, and from the far side of the forest, and from the occupied zone in Germany, and they were brought to one slope in a small valley between Romagnoux and Cunel, onto ground that had taken the whole of October to cross. There is a chapel on the crest of the slope, and rows of white marble crosses running down it. At the edge of the same village, past the village's own graveyard, there is a large German cemetery, and the guidebook notes that the detour to it takes 10 minutes. For a while there was a house there for visitors. In summer, the families of the men buried on that hillside could be given a room and a meal at the gate. It is a small fact, and it sits in the official volume between the mileage and the turning instructions. On the hill in the middle of the corridor, the one that could see everything, there is a column 180 feet high. It does not stand beside the village of Montfaucon. It stands on it. The village was not rebuilt. The monument was put up in the ruins. When they dug the foundation, they found things that had nothing to do with the war. There was an old passage cut into the soft rock, running from the ruins behind the monument down to the foot of the hill. There was a burying ground about 4 meters down, on the left of the column, probably medieval. Under the front of the right-hand wall of the main terrace, there were 3 old cellars, one below another. There had been a settlement on that hill since the 6th century. It grew up as a market around a monastery, and it was taken and burned in the wars of religion, and pulled down again in 1636, and taken by Prussian troops in 1792. The hill had been worth holding for a very long time before anyone on it had heard of the Americans. A few places were kept as they were, on purpose. At Vauquois, the whole crown of the hill is craters. The village that stood there was mined away, and the craters are still open. Along the road near Varennes there are German concrete shelters and lengths of trench that were being preserved, with signposts pointing at them. Varennes itself has a memorial park at the entrance to the village. laid out by the state of Pennsylvania for all its soldiers who served. Everywhere else, the official volume uses one phrase for what happened to the battlefield. It was placed under intensive cultivation. The trenches and the fields of wire are not visible. The shell holes and the concrete emplacements that made the whole area look like waste ground are gone. What is left is what was there before: the woods, the hills, the streams, and the names of the farms and the towns. The word "now" in all of this has a date on it as well. The volume that describes the ground was published in 1938, and the fields it calls cultivated again were cultivated in 1937, and everything it lists as being preserved was being preserved then. Someone stood on that hill 20 years after the men had gone, wrote down what 20 years had done to it, and set it in type as though that would hold. And there is a road, and you drive it slowly. The volume that describes this ground is not written as history. It is written as a route in miles and kilometers with instructions. Enter the cemetery. Proceed slowly to the far entrance. Turn right. Ascend the hill to the chapel. And stop. That is the last thing this corridor became. For 4 years it was a place where nothing moved. For 47 days it was a place where everything was trying to move at once, along a few miles of mud in both directions. Now it is a place you are told to drive through slowly, so that you can see the woods and the hills and the streams, which were the only things in it that were never going anywhere. Sleep well,